Johnny Cash was performing for 2,000 of the most dangerous men in California. Murderers. Armed robbers. Men who'd spend the rest of their lives behind bars. And when one of them stood up and sang, breaking every prison rule, the guards expected Cash to nod, to let them handle it, to keep performing like nothing happened. Instead, Cash stopped the entire show. What he did in the next 60 seconds proved that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is see the humanity in someone everyone else has given up on. Folsom State Prison, California, January 13, 1968. The dining hall had been converted into a makeshift concert venue. 2,000 inmates sat on metal folding chairs arranged in tight rows. Armed guards lined the walls, positioned every 20 feet, watching everything. The atmosphere was electric but tense. This wasn't just another prison show. This was Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison, and it was being recorded live for what would become one of the most iconic albums in country music history. Johnny Cash had a unique relationship with prisons and prisoners. Unlike other country stars who occasionally performed at correctional facilities as publicity stunts or charitable gestures, Cash genuinely connected with incarcerated men. He understood them in a way most people couldn't. Because Cash had been arrested himself. Multiple times. Drunk and disorderly. Drug possession. He'd spent nights in jail cells. He'd worn handcuffs. He'd felt the cold steel of bars and the suffocating weight of confinement, even if only for hours rather than years. When Cash sang about prisons, about longing for freedom, about the crushing monotony of being locked away from the world, he meant every single word. His most famous song was about this very prison. The song described an inmate at Folsom, trapped, fantasizing about escape, hearing a train whistle in the distance representing freedom he could never have. Cash had written it in 1955, 13 years before this concert, and it had become an anthem for prisoners everywhere. Now, Cash was performing it inside the actual walls he'd sung about. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in that room. The concert started at 9:30 in the morning. Early, because prison schedules don't bend for entertainment. Cash walked on stage wearing all black, as he always did. Black pants. Black shirt. Black boots. The man in black. He carried his acoustic guitar and stood at the microphone, looking out at the sea of blue denim prison uniforms. 2,000 men, most of whom would die in this prison, staring back at him. Cash smiled. Not a showman's smile. A genuine smile. Like he was among friends. "Hello, I'm Johnny Cash," he said, his deep voice carrying across the room without amplification. The inmates erupted. Cheering, applauding, whistling. They loved him. Because Cash was one of the few famous people who treated them like human beings instead of case numbers. The band started playing, and Cash launched into his first song. The energy in the room was incredible. Inmates clapped along. Shouted encouragement. This was the most excitement most of them had experienced in years. Cash performed song after song. The crowd was with him completely. And then, about 45 minutes into the concert, Cash started the song everyone was waiting for. The opening guitar riff was instantly recognizable. The inmates knew what was coming. The song about this very prison. About being trapped. About hearing that train. Cash began singing, his voice gravelly and powerful, and the entire room went silent, hanging on every word. That's when it happened. A prisoner in the third row, a man named Glen Sherley, stood up. He was 37 years old, serving a 15-year sentence for armed robbery. Glen had been in and out of prison since he was a teenager. He'd spent more of his adult life behind bars than outside them. He'd grown up in poverty in Oklahoma, turned to crime young, and never found a way out of the cycle. Glen was sitting there listening to Cash sing about Folsom Prison, about his life, about the trap he was caught in, and something broke open inside him. Glen started singing along. Not quietly. Loud. his voice carrying across the dining hall. He wasn't a professional singer, but he knew every word of the song, had sung it to himself 1,000 times in his cell. The other inmates turned to look at him. Some with surprise. Some with concern. Because everyone knew the rules. Sit down. Stay quiet. Don't participate. Breaking those rules meant punishment. Solitary confinement. Loss of privileges. Maybe worse. The guards saw Glen immediately. 2 of them started moving toward him, hands on their batons, ready to drag him out of the room and deal with him. This was a disruption. This was a violation of protocol. This needed to be shut down immediately. The other inmates watched, knowing Glen was about to pay a heavy price for this moment of emotion. But Johnny Cash saw it too. He saw Glen standing, singing, lost in the music. He saw the guards moving toward him. And Cash made a decision in a split second. He stopped singing mid-verse. The band, confused, trailed off. The entire room went silent. Cash walked to the edge of the stage, still holding his guitar. He looked directly at Glen. And then he pointed at him. "Keep singing," Cash said, his voice clear and commanding. The guards stopped. Frozen. Uncertain. Cash was the star. This was his show. And he'd just given an order that directly contradicted prison protocol. "Go ahead, brother," Cash said to Glen. "Let me hear you." Glen stood there, stunned. Every eye in the room was on him. The guards hadn't moved, but they hadn't backed off either. They were waiting to see what Cash would do next. Glen's voice was shaking when he started singing again, picking up where Cash had left off. His voice was raw, emotional, filled with everything he'd been carrying for 15 years. He sang about being trapped. About longing for freedom. About the train he could hear but would never ride. Cash listened, smiling, nodding along. And then he did something even more unexpected. He started playing guitar again, accompanying Glen. Harmonizing with him. Turning this disruption into a duet. The 2,000 inmates in that room realized what they were witnessing. Johnny Cash, one of the biggest stars in country music, sharing his stage with a prisoner. Treating him as an equal. Giving him a voice. The guards looked at each other, uncertain what to do. Their instinct was to shut this down. But Cash was in control of the room now. If they dragged Glen out, they'd riot. The inmates would turn on them. And Cash would probably walk off stage and cancel the rest of the concert. So they stood there, watching, letting it happen. Glen sang the entire verse. When he finished, the room exploded. 2,000 men on their feet, cheering, applauding, some crying. For Glen, certainly, who'd just experienced the most incredible moment of his life. But also for themselves. Because in that moment, Johnny Cash had shown them they still mattered. That they were still human. That their voices still deserved to be heard. Cash walked back to his microphone, gestured for the crowd to settle down. "Thank you, brother," he said to Glen. "That was beautiful. What's your name?" "Glen Sherley," Glen said, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Well, Glen Sherley, you've got a hell of a voice," Cash said. "You keep singing. Don't let anybody tell you to stop." The concert continued. Cash performed several more songs. The energy in the room had changed. It was no longer just a performance. It was something deeper. A connection. A recognition of shared humanity. When the concert ended, Cash didn't just leave. He stayed backstage, talking to guards, to prison administrators. He asked about Glen Sherley specifically. Who was he? What was his story? How much time did he have left? Cash learned that Glen was a songwriter. He'd written hundreds of songs in prison, scribbling lyrics on scraps of paper, humming melodies to himself in his cell. He'd never done anything with them. Who would listen to songs written by a prisoner? But Glen had poured his entire life into those songs. His pain, his regret, his hope, his dreams of freedom he'd probably never experience. Cash asked to see some of Glen's songs. The prison administrators were skeptical, but Cash insisted. A few days later, they sent Cash a collection of lyrics Glen had written. Cash read through them, and one song stopped him cold. It was called Greystone Chapel, about the prison chapel at Folsom, about finding redemption and hope in the darkest place imaginable. The lyrics were simple but profound. The melody, as Glen had described it, was haunting. Cash did something extraordinary. He arranged the music for the song, rehearsed it with his band, and when he returned to Folsom Prison for a second recording session a few weeks later, he performed Glen's song. In front of 2,000 inmates. In front of the man who wrote it. And Cash dedicated it to Glen Sherley by name, telling the entire prison that this was Glen's song, Glen's art, Glen's voice even though Cash was the one singing it. The performance was captured on the live album, At Folsom Prison, which was released in May 1968. The album became one of the most successful country albums of all time, reaching #1 on the country charts and crossing over to mainstream success. Millions of people heard that album. And millions of people heard Glen Sherley's song, with Johnny Cash giving him full credit. But Cash didn't stop there. He began advocating for Glen's release. Cash wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a politician. But he was famous, and he used that fame to put pressure on the California Parole Board. He wrote letters. He made phone calls. He told anyone who would listen that Glen Sherley deserved a second chance. That he was talented, remorseful, ready to contribute to society if given the opportunity. In 1971, 3 years after that concert, Glen Sherley was released from prison. 12 years early. The parole board cited his good behavior, his artistic contributions, and the advocacy of Johnny Cash as factors in their decision. Glen walked out of Folsom Prison with nothing but the clothes he was wearing and a recommendation letter from Johnny Cash. Cash hired Glen to work on his touring crew. Not as a charity case. As a legitimate employee. Glen helped set up equipment, managed logistics, traveled with the band. He was part of the team. And for a while, it seemed like the fairy tale was complete. A prisoner whose life was saved by a country music legend who saw his humanity when nobody else did. But the reality was more complicated. Glen struggled on the outside. The skills that helped him survive in prison didn't translate to freedom. The structure of prison life, as oppressive as it was, had been predictable. Life outside was chaotic, overwhelming. Glen started drinking heavily. His temper, which he'd learned to control in prison, became a problem. He got into fights. He struggled to maintain relationships. The trauma of 15 years in prison wasn't something that just disappeared because he was free. Cash tried to help. Paid for rehab. Got Glen therapy. Kept him employed even when his behavior made it difficult. But Glen was fighting demons that Cash couldn't see or understand. The weight of wasted years. The guilt of crimes committed. The impossibility of ever fully returning to a society that had moved on without him. In 1978, 10 years after that concert at Folsom, Glen Sherley took his own life. He was 42 years old. The news devastated Johnny Cash. He felt he'd failed Glen. That he should have done more, seen the signs, intervened somehow. Cash spoke at Glen's funeral, and he struggled to find words adequate to the loss. Glen Sherley taught me something I'll never forget, Cash said, his voice breaking. He taught me that talent and humanity exist in the places we're told not to look. Behind bars. In the darkness. Among people society has given up on. Glen's life mattered. His art mattered. His voice mattered. And the fact that his story ended in tragedy doesn't erase the beauty of what he created or the courage it took for him to keep creating it even when he had every reason to give up. The story of Johnny Cash and Glen Sherley is complicated. It doesn't have a happy ending. Glen didn't ride off into the sunset, saved by fame and fortune. He struggled, suffered, and ultimately couldn't escape the damage that prison had done to him. But that doesn't make what Johnny Cash did meaningless. In that moment at Folsom Prison, when Glen stood up and sang and the guards moved to silence him, Cash had a choice. He could have let it happen. Nodded to the guards. Kept performing. Nobody would have blamed him. But instead, Cash stopped everything and gave Glen a voice. He shared his stage. He acknowledged Glen's humanity. He treated him as an equal. And for Glen, for those 3 minutes, he wasn't a prisoner. He was an artist. A singer. A man whose voice mattered. That moment didn't save his life in the end. But it gave him something equally important. It gave him dignity. It gave him recognition. It proved that despite everything, despite all the mistakes and the years lost and the future stolen, Glen Sherley still had something valuable to offer the world. The recording of that concert, with Glen's song included, remains one of the most powerful live albums ever made. At Folsom Prison didn't just showcase Johnny Cash's talent. It showcased his compassion. His willingness to see humanity in places most people refuse to look. His understanding that prisoners are still people, that their stories still matter, that their art still deserves to be heard. Today, prison reform advocates point to that concert as a turning point. It humanized prisoners in a way that political speeches never could. It showed America that the men behind bars weren't monsters. They were human beings. Flawed, yes. Guilty of crimes, absolutely. But still capable of beauty, of art, of redemption. Johnny Cash continued performing in prisons for the rest of his career. He never forgot where he came from. Never forgot that he could have ended up behind bars permanently if circumstances had been slightly different. And he never forgot Glen Sherley. In interviews late in his life, Cash would bring up Glen unprompted. Talk about that moment at Folsom. About the prisoner who sang back. About the choice he made to honor that voice instead of silence it. "I think about Glen all the time," Cash said in a 1990 interview, 12 years after Glen's death. "I think about what could have been different. What I should have done. But I also think about that moment when he stood up and sang. The courage that took. The beauty of his voice. And I'm grateful I was there to hear it. Even if I couldn't save him in the end, I'm grateful I could give him those 3 minutes. Sometimes 3 minutes of dignity is all we can offer. But it's not nothing. It matters." The story of Johnny Cash and Glen Sherley reminds us that compassion isn't measured by outcomes. Cash couldn't fix Glen's life. Couldn't erase 15 years of prison. Couldn't heal the trauma or remove the addiction or solve the profound psychological damage of incarceration. But he could do something. He could acknowledge. He could listen. He could share his platform with someone who had none. And that choice, made in a split second in a prison dining hall in 1968, changed at least 2 lives. It gave Glen Sherley a moment of joy and recognition in a life filled with darkness. And it reminded Johnny Cash why he did what he did. Not for the fame or the money or the applause. But for moments like that. When music connects. When humanity recognizes itself. When a prisoner becomes a person again, if only for 3 minutes. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold stories about the moments that made legends truly legendary. Hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear about the power of recognizing humanity in places society tells us not to look.